Hello everyone, good morning, and welcome to the New Jersey Invitational, part of the SCG Tour, the conclusion of Season 2 of the SCG Tour, brought to you by the awesome people over at Ultimate Guard. I am your host, Cedric Phillips, and I am joined by quite a crew of people here with me. We've got New Jersey's own Patrick Sullivan. How are you?
Couldn't be more excited. Could not be more excited.
You're home? Now you've been home for a couple of days. You've taken New Jersey in, and now you're ready for a tournament, aren't you?
3 full days of action, multiple formats. I think the tightest race of all time in terms of people getting qualified for the Players' Championship. And we are in one of the crucibles of competitive American Magic.
Yep.
Central New Jersey. Couldn't be happier to be back.
Matthias Sun is also joining us here this morning. How are you, my friend?
We're doing very well this morning. I, too, love where both formats are. I'm looking forward to a great weekend. We have combo decks winning our opens. We have Emrakul's cast in standard. I couldn't be happier.
And last but certainly not least is Ryan Overturf. Now, Ryan, there's not a lot of Delvers floating around right now. Are you sure you still want to be here and do this show?
You know, I'm less excited than Patrick, but there's a couple of Grixis decks in standard.
Okay.
And there's still the outside shot of 1 or 2 in modern as well, so fingers crossed.
Okay, fair enough. Optimism. I like optimism this morning. Well, we are going to start with a little standard action. It's a pretty wild format from what we saw for the first 2 weeks of Season 2 of the SCG Tour, where it was Bant Company everywhere. So we take a short moment. Now we get ready here for our standard metagame breakdown. So let's talk standard here this morning from New Jersey. We've got 8 rounds of it, 4 today, which is Friday, 4 tomorrow, which will be Saturday. However, Sunday is a modern top 8, so we'll get to that in just a little bit. But this standard format, if you take a look at SCG Columbus, you take a look at SCG Baltimore, you're thinking Bant Company everywhere. That's it. There's no other deck. That's what those results kind of showed. However, as we made our way through the Pro Tour and Grand Prix Portland last weekend and the Standard Classic that we saw in Syracuse, things a little bit different, but we got to start with Public Enemy number 1 because, Patrick, coming into this weekend, you got to be thinking about Collected Company, Jamoko's Command, and your favorite, Reflector Mage.
Well, I still expect this to be the most popular deck in the room, though not necessarily the most successful. I think the secret is out on the recipe to beat this sort of strategy. You want to be playing a lot of cheap removal, cards that play at instant speed, that play underneath Spellcaller and Reflector Mage, and then go 5+ with Planeswalkers and Sweepers. I think Languish and Radiant Flames are both well-positioned cards against this deck. So the first couple of weeks of the standard format, if you look at the results of the Open, it didn't look optimistic. It looked like a lot of Bant Company and the deck was potentially oppressive, but I think after the Pro Tour, people have the recipe together of how you combat this deck.
Now, Matthias, this is the kind of deck to me that you would almost certainly never play. You would try to beat. So how are you trying to attack this thing?
There are ways to attack it. But I don't know how many of them are that good right now. I think Bant Company has what I would call good matchup syndrome, and a lot of the best decks of all time have this, which is when you walk around the room and you ask people how their Bant Company matchup, every single person, regardless of deck, is going to say, well, my deck beats Bant Company. You know, the blue-red players are going to tell you this, the Delirium players are going to tell you this, the Emerge players are going to tell you this, and somehow we're going to see, you know, 3 people playing Bant Company make the top 8 of the tournament. You can attack it a lot of different ways, but I'm not sure you get much over 50% no matter which direction you go.
Now, Ryan, there are a lot of kind of goofy decks out there right now that are trying to attack this. Delirium decks, the blue-red Thermal Alchemist deck, which we'll get to, Emerge decks. Does any of this stuff interest you, or are you kind of a Bant Company guy?
I generally go down swinging against the best deck against my better judgment a lot of the time. So, you know, maybe I lose to it if I play a different deck. And one of the problems with the other decks is you can have some decks that have very solid positions against Bant Company specifically. Take a look at Sam Black's Pro Tour deck, convincingly beating Bant Company. The problem was the rest of the field. And that's the issue you run into. Even if Bant Company is 30% of the field, if you lose convincingly to maybe 50% of the remaining field, that's a serious problem.
I'm curious to see what's going to happen with this particular deck. So in regards to, obviously people are going to play this deck. There's no question about that. But the small thing that's been happening recently is the slow removal of Jamoko's Command. We saw at Grand Prix Portland 1 kind of out of decks. Paul Rizzo played none in his main deck and just a few copies in the sideboard. That'll be something to keep our eyes on, I think, over the course of this weekend to see exactly where maybe one could argue the best spell in Standard is working its way out of this particular deck. But we move on to the next deck we're going to talk about because we're tired of Bant Company. No more of that. let's talk about Black-White Control, the deck that did win the Pro Tour in the hands of Lucas Blohan. A couple different ways you can go with this deck, Matthias. You can go creatureless, like we've seen with Secure the Wisps and Westfall Abbey, and a lot of Planeswalkers. You can have some creatures like Kalidas, Linvala, and Avacyn, or you can actually have this kind of weird Thalia's Lancers version of the deck. What do you like about this deck?
Well, I think the deck has been very well positioned for quite a while now, even actually before the most recent set release. Much like Mono Red last year, this is the kind of deck that I haven't seen a deck that's won a Pro Tour and is getting second place at Grand Prix get so little press as Black-White Control is getting right now. Yeah, it has some very good finishes, and I'm especially interested to see if we see that Black-White Angel Control you're talking about, the kind that builds Brazella and can fuse into that card. We actually got top 4 finish last week at the Syracuse Classic as well playing it, and I kind of am thinking there's something in that shell.
Ryan, how do you feel about this deck? I mean, it's pretty, if I'm being honest, kind of boring. Kill all your stuff, play some Planeswalkers, eventually kill you. Is this something that you think is a good choice for this weekend?
It's a solid choice. You have to have a good build. I think that Lucas Blohan, if you check out his tournament report, he was convinced he had no good matchups in the top 8, just kind of won in spite of that. For me, though, playing against this deck, every time my opponent casts Sorin Grim Nemesis, I just sink in my chair. It's lights out. That card is so good. And with all the other cards being kind of fair, medium, Read the Bones, not the most exciting, you just have to get up to Sorin and you'll close a lot of games pretty easily from there.
Patrick, I mean, this is your premier Languish deck of the format. I know other decks do have Languish in them, like a Grixis Pack deck and various other black-based strategies, but this is the Languish deck of the format. Is this the kind of deck, I know you've been a fan of Languish over the past couple of months, you kind of like its positioning this weekend?
I do like its positioning, but I'm one of the people that's in Matthias' camp of, you can never get me to play this deck in a tournament.
Sure.
Absolutely not. The deck is structurally sound in the way that it attacks Band Company. It's a lot of cheap removal that plays underneath, and then 5+ mana cards to avoid Spellqueller and to a lesser extent Reflector Mage. So I like it from that position. But in my mind, the proactive cards in Standard are so much more powerful than the reactive cards that I would rather just be doing something proactive, whatever that happens to be. You can choose, there's a lot of good options, than trying to hope that the removal spells that you have line up the right way against the proactive cards of the format, especially because the proactive pool is so deep and so versatile that trying to find the right mixture of removal is very challenging.
It can be, and we see now with this particular deck, you got Grasp of Darkness, Languish, Ultimate Price, Anguish Unmaking, Ruinous Path. What's the right numbers of those? Who knows?
Two.
Yeah, two of all of them.
Right.
Yeah, who knows? Maybe someone will figure it out. I don't know. But it's obviously a choice that won the Pro Tour. So there's some merit to wanting to play this type of strategy here this weekend. Now, let's talk about a breakout deck from the Pro Tour. Went 9-1 at the Pro Tour, won the Syracuse Classic in the hands of Todd Anderson. That's the Blue-Red Thermal Alchemist deck. This is kind of the new hotness right now, Ryan. We got Fevered Visions, we got Thermal Alchemist, we got Collective Defiance, bunch of burn spells. We'll get to you, I promise. So, what do you think about this strategy? This seems maybe more your alley.
I love this deck.
I figured you would.
There's been some interesting decisions going forward with the deck. We saw Blohan and Ramini was playing 4 Storm Chaser Mages. So there's a couple decisions you can make. That kind of shoehorns you into being aggressive in every game, whereas with Thing in the Ice, you can play a little bit slower. So I'm not sure what the best build is at this time. Though the thing about this deck, win, lose, or draw, you get to draw so many cards. So it's a blast to play either way. So it's very likely I'd be registering this deck on those grounds alone.
Matthias, I know you love a blue card. I don't think you love a red card, though. So we got you in one camp that you like, one camp that you don't like. Look, this deck is in a weird spot, I think. It's kind of this thing where it was the talk of the Pro Tour, post-Pro Tour, and then last weekend in Syracuse and Grand Prix Portland had a pretty good performance. But do you think people are just ready now for what this does?
I think the deck is still really evolving. This is a deck, as far as pound for pound, its cards are a lot worse than all the other decks in Standard. But at the same time, because your game plan is so linear, maybe you can ignore some of these more powerful strategies. And I'm really excited to see what people are coming up with. Every list I see of this deck is so different than the last one. I think just yesterday we were looking at, Magic Online has now started taking to playing Alms of the Vein in this deck and going into black for it, which you think, what does that even mean? So I think this is the deck that could have the biggest breakout this weekend or could fall the hardest.
Now, Patrick, I know you love burning people. I know that you played kind of the blue-red Saito deck in the previous Standard season before Eldritch Moon came along. How do you feel about this deck? It seems almost like an evolution of that deck.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of ways that you can approach this sort of strategy because the card pool is so deep for this thing.
Yep.
You can go with the Storm Chaser Mage, beat down, build with the deck, or you can do kind of Todd Anderson's funkier Southpaw style of Thing in the Ice and drawing a bunch of cards.
Yep.
I think either of those strategies is a reasonable one to take. My concern with this deck is the Bant Company matchup. The deck attacks well, blocks well. You have Dramoka's Command that fights your Fevered Visions. That matchup, I think, is very hard to get even close to 50%. If the field is wide open, if there's a lot more of the slower graveyard-centric decks, I think there's an opportunity for this deck to be very good. But there are a lot of different approaches you can take with it. I like what Todd was doing. I'm more of a Storm Chaser Mage type of person myself. That's probably where I would go with this, but the card pool is very deep for this sort of strategy, even though it's a little unorthodox.
Yeah, you can even play a third color and make it a Grixis deck. I know Dan Ward did that last weekend in Portland. It's an 11-4 finish where he had Collective Brutality, Alms of the Vein, as you did mention.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Who knows? But it is a burn spell, and it does gain you some life and buys you some time to find that closing burn spell. So we'll see how that deck does perform. But let's talk about a deck that we know can perform, because it did win Grand Prix Portland, and that is Jund Delirium. So I'm talking Ishkana, Graf Widow, Traverse the Uvenwald, and Emrakul the Promise End, along with just a lot of powerful cards across the 3-color deck. Matthias, how do you feel about this deck? I mean, it just won a Grand Prix.
I really do like the Delirium strategies. It's really similar. It's coming out of the Seasons Past shell that we saw last season. Ishkana is one of the cards that I can just say is definitively good against the Bant Company deck. It buys you 2-3 turns before they can break through it. What I think is really interesting is whether or not this is going to turn into a control deck or more of a mid-range deck. The Jund Delirium deck that we saw win, it's very threat-light, but it has your Ishkanas and then Emrakul and some Mindbenders, then is Fiery Impulsing and Kozilek's returning. At the same time, we see Black-Green Delirium, which is kind of doing this thing in Standard, which we've had for about 6 months now, where you play Tireless Trackers, Sylvan Advocates, and Languishes all in the same deck, and you kind of just split the difference of pressuring and then removing. So 2 different strategies, but I think both of them has a lot of merit in the current meta.
Patrick, I mean, this is a mid-range strategy through and through. It's certainly not fully control. It can play aggressive if you're black-green. Sometimes with the build, with the addition of red, you can be a little bit more aggressive, but this is a straight-up mid-range deck. You a fan of this kind of strategy? It seems a little conflicted.
Well, I like where this deck is positioned right now. Again, structurally sound against Bant Company, as you're playing underneath with cheap stuff and then going 5+ to avoid Spellcaller and, again, to a lesser extent, Reflector Mage. So I like it from that position. What I also like about this deck is that you have a real sideboard. We see this come up all the time with Bant Company, where because the deck needs a critical mass of 3 mana or cheaper creatures for Collected Company to function, you can only side out so many of your creatures before you start paying costs in other ways. So yeah, this is a mid-range deck, and sometimes the deck looks a little awkward for Game 1 purposes, but you get to clean up a lot of that stuff post-board.
It's a mid-range slog, Ryan, but it does have a lot of powerful cards in it. How do you kind of look at this deck with how you like to play Magic? Well,
it's difficult to think about this deck without the context of Temur Emerge. Really, you're asking yourself, do I want to have Distended Mindbender, or do I want to have Elder Deep Fiend? The rest of the stuff, a good amount does change, but that's the big fundamental difference for me. And for Distended Mindbender, it's the idea you cast it on turn 4 and the game is over right then and there. So you maybe play 3 copies, because after that, the second copy gets a lot worse. Your hand's already kind of empty of their best spells. You hope to close the game quickly from there. Whereas I prefer the Elder Deep Fiend decks, where the idea is to have it on turn 4, then on turn 5, then on turn 6, where they're better in multiples, can break games where you're already behind over, where the Mindbender you're trying to get in front of your opponent. So I'm more about having more play as the game goes longer. These decks, they're appealing to me. I can definitely see the draw of Mindbender, but I'm more of a Deep Fiend guy.
Well, he's more of a Deep Fiend guy, which means we're going to talk about Elder Deep Fiend now, because there are Temur Emerge decks out there that have been doing well recently in the hands of some guy named Owen Turtenwald and some other dude named Andrew Brown, who just top-8'd the last Pro Tour. Elder Deep Fiend's power level's through the roof. The first time you read the card, you know it's fantastic. The trick is the shell around it and how you actually go about casting it, because you need some bodies for this to be able to emerge through. So we're looking at cards like Nissa, Shaman of the Forgotten Ways, Primal Druid, stuff like that. But there's also the engine with Gather the Pack and Grapple with the Past as well that make this deck kind of go. Owen took the route of having this be basically the best Emrakul deck. He had 3 copies of that card, where Andrews was a lot more of an emerge deck where you saw cards like Wretched Griff. So, Patrick, I'll start with you. What do you think of this? Because this is a really weird deck. Both players said post-tournament, like, this is one of the hardest decks I've ever played.
Yeah, obviously there's a lot of moving parts. You need to be getting a bunch of different card types in your graveyard, and then there's the actual act of playing Magic beyond that, and a lot of these cards are very interactive. They have pretty complicated text boxes. I really like where this deck is positioned. It would likely be my choice for this weekend. The one concern I would have going in is just, are there going to be beatdown decks? Is your matchup palatable there? Because there's a lot of time spent in this deck just kind of setting up your graveyard, spinning your tires a little bit, and I would be worried about getting run out of the gates by someone who's just curving out 1, 2, 3, 4. Assuming that's not something that's going on in the metagame, and it's light on that right now, this is the deck I would be sleeping up.
Matthias, you see a lot of cards with this deck. Kozilek's Return is very powerful. Obviously, Emrakul and Elder Deep Fiend are very powerful. This maybe your speed?
It would be my speed traditionally, I think this deck, as it's getting known in the community, is the trap of the weekend, and I would stay away from playing this one. Right now, its performance has started to drop off. I think memo is out that if you actually kill Pilgrim's Eye, you can strand a lot of draws of the deck. Yeah, it's got some powerful things going on with it, but at the same time, if you're going to play an Emrakul deck, I'm thinking Delirium's the better Emrakul deck, and at that point, I'm not sure what this has to offer, at least in its current build. That said, between zombies and the Teamer build, maybe there's a new way to build this that could take the weekend.
What do you think about Emerge, Ryan? I mean, obviously there's a lot of power here, but it is a weird deck to build and play.
Yeah, and one thing about this deck is it's somewhat resilient. You can kill the Pilgrim's Eye, you can kill the Primal Druid, what have you. There was a really interesting match in the Pro Tour where Owen gets hit by an Infinite Obliteration, takes his Emrakul. His hand is just 3 Deep Fiends face up, and he casts them all for 8 mana and wins convincingly. So that's an element of this deck that I really like, as opposed to, say, the blue-red deck where you can go long even if your opponent is ready for you. You don't just kill your Fever Resonance and then you're kind of out of the game from there. The deck does have some play to it, so even if it has a target on it, I think it is somewhat resilient. Though if you have a fast clock and disruption, it's going to be very difficult for this deck to win. So I'd probably be off of this as well.
Well, we're going to see how things do shake out as far as deck selection is concerned for Standard. Remember, 4 rounds today, which is Friday, 4 rounds tomorrow, of course, which is Saturday. But our top 8 and the highlight of this tournament is Modern, where we're going to watch 4 rounds today, 4 rounds tomorrow, and then our elimination rounds be of that fantastic format. So now we prepare for our Modern metagame breakdown. Modern. I love Modern. I don't care what anyone says. Turn 3 format, banning cards left and right. I don't care. I love Modern. It's awesome. It's just a fully degenerate format. There's a lot of play to it. There's a lot of changes that have been made recently to it with bannings, unbannings, and apparently a new deck, which I did not expect. But Matthias and Ryan were both there to cover Ross Merriam winning in Syracuse with Dredge. We're going to get to both of you guys in a minute about that. Patrick, I'm going to start with you. First of all, let me toot the old shriek horn here. Toot toot. Because, yeah, that's a thing. That's apparently a thing that's going on in the format right now. So is Greater Gargadon, so is Bridge from Below, so is Prize Amalgam, so is Insolent Neonite. What the hell is going on here? What is this deck?
I mean, this was a type of strategy that was only a couple cards short. We had seen Benjavine fueled Dredge decks over the course of Modern's history, and Insolent Neonate and Prize Amalgam are enormously powerful enablers for this type of strategy. And that's been the tipping point where now Golgari, Grave Troll, and Sequinib, these sort of menaces of older vintage formats, now get their chance to shine a little bit in Modern. I think this deck is very good. Obviously, last week in Syracuse, the metagame was not really ready for this sort of thing.
Yeah.
There are a lot of very potent anti-graveyard sideboard cards available to people in Modern, like Grafdigger's Cage, Leyline of the Void, and so forth. So it's going to be interesting for me to see, with the information, now that people know that this is on the radar, can the metagame handle this, or is the raw power of this deck just so high that maybe we need to be talking about Bridge from Below or Golgari Grave Troll or some other card, maybe seeing its way out the door the next time there's an update.
Matthias, you were there firsthand. You witnessed all this happen. You saw Ross win. You saw Tom Ross make the top 8. Is this as good as advertised?
This deck's great. We saw people making 11 power on turn 2. We saw them winning games on turn 10 off of like a Conflagrate for 10. This deck's the real deal. And last week was really the weekend that you wanted to be playing it. Now we're going to see whether or not you can win when all the Jund players actually have Leyline of the Void in their sideboard. No one had that last week. But based on how good it was last weekend, I'm not sure that it will fall short.
Now, Ryan, you were there as well. You're his partner in crime. My question for you is pretty simple. Beat it or join it?
I'd be inclined to join it, but if you plan to beat it, make sure your plan is very focused. There's a lot of these linear decks in Modern where you can have a hate card, and maybe even bank on that deck just kind of self-destructing. A deck like Hexproof doesn't mulligan very well, a deck like Burn doesn't mulligan very well, so you'll kind of get some wins by those decks just not doing their thing. We consistently saw Dredge mulligan to 5 and still just get on the table with 8 power on turn 2 anyway, because the initial hand doesn't matter. You need a red source and a Faithless Looting, and you can explode from there no matter what's happening. So this deck is very resilient, which is a good point for picking it up and joining the Join-Up team.
I mean, this is the thing. This is the elephant in the room. right, for this whole entire weekend. As much fun as Standard's going to be, as much fun as Modern's going to be, the question now is, are people going to play this deck? You know, outside of Tom Ross, Ross Merriam, you know, Jerry Thompson, Todd Anderson, those guys can win with anything. We already know that. Are players with maybe lesser names going to say, holy crap, I can't believe this actually happened, I'm going to play this deck? Or are they saying, I'm not going to do that, but I've got Ley Lines, I've got Rest in Peace, I've got Hate, Cage, all that stuff, we're going to find out. And now, as we know with Modern, there are a lot of options. Matthias, you mentioned Jund, and I'm going to go right to you about it. Dark Confidant, Lightning Bolt, Scavenging Ooze. We expect to say Ley Lines. It's the most boring deck ever, but it always wins.
Jund was the most popular deck last weekend. It put the most players into day 2. It had the most copies of any deck in top 8, and I would expect all those things to be true again this weekend. Jund is very powerful, and the more narrow a format gets, the better Jund gets. I've often heard it described as, okay, there are 7 decks to beat, and when you play Jund, you get to pick 5 of them. Now, if 2 of those 7 decks are things that no one's playing, say you're a Jund player and you decide that this weekend, you know, you don't really need to beat Affinity, and you don't really need to beat some, you know, like a Storm style deck. Okay, well now you can focus on the other decks. Right now, based on what we saw last weekend, there were only 4 decks in the open that had more than 4 copies into day 2. That is a perfect spot for Jund, and I think Jund will be great this weekend.
Well, Jund seems like it's great every weekend, Ryan. Now, the question I'll ask you is, if you're a Jund player getting ready for the Dredge Menace, are you kind of honing in with cards like Scavenging Ooze, like Jund Charm, like Leyline, or you're just saying, you know what, my deck is just kind of good at beating everything. I've got 53% against the metagame. That's good enough for me.
Check out the SCG Live Twitter account from last weekend. You'll see a nice picture of Andrew Boswell with a Scavenging Ooze in play against Ross Merriam with like 400 permanents. That card just does not do enough.
Okay.
If you expect to play against Dredge, you need to address this deck with a sideboard. Your Kalitas is too slow, your Scavenging Ooze is even too slow. I think Leyline of the Void is like the slam dunk. If you can find room for that card, go for Leyline. You can maybe play something like Grafdigger's Cage. There's not a lot of collected company in the format right now, so if you have 4 slots or even 3 slots, I'd probably go Leyline, and I think that's a smart place to be this weekend.
Patrick, it's Jund. It's not going anywhere. We know it's going to be here for a while, and like Matthias said last weekend, most play deck in day 2, most play deck in top 8. We know it's going to be here. You know, if you're a player coming in the tournament, are you just kind of saying, okay, you know what, I know I'm going to play against a couple times and that's life, or are you more of a player who said, I'm just going to play this deck and I'll be fine with it?
I would be totally happy to be playing Jund this weekend. I think Matthias hit the nail on the head there with the point of when the metagame tightens, when it narrows down a little bit, and you can make these calls like, okay, there's not going to be that much affinity. So I can get rid of the Shatterstorm in my sideboard, and I can go from 2 Ancient Grudges to 1, and now I have slots for Leyline of the Void or Anger of the Gods or whatever you want for this sort of deck. As long as that decision doesn't come back to haunt you, as long as you're not playing against all these decks where you don't have the right sideboard cards, I think Jund's an excellent choice.
It's really hard to not okay this decision. If one of my friends comes up to me and they're just like, I'm playing Jund this weekend, yeah, okay.
Right.
There's not a lot of conversation we had. Good luck. I hope your 13th, 14th, and 15th sideboard card are correct, because your main deck's not going to be very wacky. It's the safest choice, and truthfully, it's the choice I expect to see most of the big name players play this weekend.
Well, I did speak to one big name player, and he is playing that deck. I won't reveal the name.
Of course.
We'll get into that in a little bit. And he handed me the deck list, and he said, I have nothing to say.
Yeah.
There's no additional, some discard spells and some removal, and a couple anti-graveyard sideboard cards flavored to taste, whatever.
Yeah.
Nothing to say.
It is what it is. It's going to win, too. Trust me. It'll do very well this weekend. Let's talk Infect. Let's talk Blighted Agent. Let's talk Glister Elf. Let's talk Vines of the Vastwood and all the various pump spells. This is an easy deck to go to. It's very powerful, Ryan. How do you feel like it lines up in a metagame with Dredge and Jund, however?
Jund is a problematic matchup. Infect can have a lot of game against them. You force them to have a lot of very efficient interaction. The fact that they have access to Inquisition and Thoughtseize where the life doesn't matter, and Lightning Bolt is going to make a tough time for Infect. Dredge has a lot of tools as well. Narcomoeba, just to block Inkmoth Nexus, can buy the Dredge player enough time to win. They also have Dark Blast out of the sideboard. Conflagrate can clean up any of your non-Inkmoth Nexus creatures. Infect's in a tough spot, but this deck is so resilient. I've seen it time and again win in games where it looks like it's in a lot of trouble. It's hard for Infect to be a terrible choice, but it's probably not your best option this weekend.
Matthias, you were there last weekend with Ryan in Syracuse. You saw what the metagame looked like coming into the weekend. How do you feel about what he said?
Medium at best. Now, Infect's a great deck, so I don't think it's ever going to be unplayable, but the 1 and 2 decks were Jund and Jeskai, and I don't really like either of those from the Infect's point of view. Now, maybe what you can benefit from is that For once, you're not the combo deck with the bullseye on it, so people might skimp on some of the cards that are traditionally good against you, and an Infect Cleric could get some mileage off that, but I'm probably still off it this weekend.
I mean, I'll say this for Infect. Patrick, I'll let you speak on this as well. Tom Ross is known for playing Infect in every single tournament. He went to Dredge last weekend. That's got to speak volumes of the power level of deck and maybe how he feels Infect is positioned right now.
So, I mean, this is the one deck over the last year or so that I'm startled is still legal in its current iteration. It violates the turn 3 rule so consistently and is such a powerful deck that it's actually a little bizarre to me that it's been able to fly under Wizards' radar. That said, this weekend I'm not thrilled with it as a choice. I recommend this deck all the time to people who are uncertain in Modern, but not this weekend. I'm not convinced the Dredge matchup is good enough. I think there's going to be a lot of copies of Jund, a very problematic matchup. And again, as Matthias said, maybe you get some percentage points about people having fewer sideboard cards than usual, but if you're playing against a lot of copies of Dark Blast, and both the Dredge deck and Jund can access that if they want to, might not be the right weekend for this deck.
Just a couple more decks to go before we do start our invitational. Players starting to sit down, so we will start to speed up just a little bit here. Let's talk Jeskai Control. Matthias, you're a blue player. You've got Nahiri here. You've got Snapcaster Mage. You've got Path to Exile. The question, of course, is, with Dredge being a big thing, this seems like maybe a tough deck to play. It seems like Dredge would prey on a deck like this.
Dredge will traditionally play on a deck like this. Much like Jund, the Jeskai deck's going to have to rely on its sideboard to win here. It gets Rest in Peace instead of Leyline. That's definitely a downgrade. This deck is fine because it's very powerful, but it's probably just that this weekend.
Ryan, again, you were there last weekend in Syracuse. You watched a lot of Modern last weekend. How do we feel about Jeskai with what we expect this weekend?
Jeskai's fine. It has a very good main deck at dealing with a lot of fair decks. And Nahiri the Harbinger actually helps the deck a lot with the unfair decks, but Dredge is too fast for that. The Jund matchup is probably solidly favorable. Anyone that's just playing a fair game on the table, you're pretty favored against, but I think you're going to run into some nonsense this weekend that you don't want to see with a deck like this. It's a little
like
too
Jeskai
slow.
in the past, Patrick. Maybe you like it in the future, but do you like it this weekend?
I mean, I imagine there's a recipe here between Rest in Peace and Anger of the Gods that you can make your Dredge matchup palatable, but I think the field's too wide open, and I would be really apprehensive about playing a reactive control deck this weekend. Jund's a little bit different. It's proactive. You can tap out and forward a plan, but trying to sit back and react to things, I think Modern might just be a little too volatile right now for that sort of thing.
Now, we've only talked about 4 decks. This is Modern, people. We know that there are like 24 decks. So, I think of stuff like Eidolon of the Great Revel for Burn. That could be a pretty good choice this weekend. I think about second place last weekend with Through the Breach and Primeval Titan and what's going on there. So that seems like a fine choice. When you got second place in the tournament, we can't forget about Eclectic Company variants. So we're talking about Kiki Core, we're talking about Obzon Company, and it's Infinite Life combo. And even for me, I'm a Boggle man. Not this weekend, but I'm a Boggle man, so that could be an option for some players who maybe are a little bit newer to Modern and just want a little something simple to just move forward with. So there are a lot of options here this weekend, but I'm going to start all the way down here with you, Ryan, as we put a close on this particular show. What would you play in each format, and who are you going to pick this weekend as a player to maybe have a good weekend? Sure,
in Standard, I'd probably play a build of the Blue-Red deck with Fever Visions. I'm not sure exactly which build, but for sure locked in on Fever Visions, figure the rest out from there. In Modern, I'd stick to Grixis Delver. It puts some graveyard hate in the sideboard, call it good. I think the deck is still great. The biggest issue is being able to play the deck well. It's extremely unforgiving, but I think it is still very powerful. Pick for the tournament, I'm going to go with Todd Stevens. He's had consistent results through the circuit here. He's in position to potentially make it for one of the Season 2 slots for the PC, so that's really good. His deck building, very impressive. Week 1 of New Standard in Columbus, he was already playing Green-Black Delirium.
Yep.
He was one of the innovators of Bant Eldrazi. I think that he really knows what he's talking about when he selects his deck for tournaments. A multi-format tournament rewards that even more.
Matthias, make your choices. Deck for each format and player to do well.
So if I were playing this weekend, I probably wouldn't register Bant Company, and that would be a mistake. I think the deck right now is just good enough that you should be playing it until the format moves somewhere else. In Modern, right now with Jund and Jeskai on top, I like the big mana strategies. They're traditionally good against both of them. I think the one caveat is you need to make sure that you're good against Dredge. So I'd look at a deck that can easily find its graveyard hate. So I'm going to go ahead and look at Tron. I'm going to make sure I have some cages, some relics, find those with Ancient Stirrings, and then beat up on Jund and Jeskai. As far as a player, I'm going to go all of Season 2 here. I think like Metagame Gurus has been the breakout team this season, and for me, the biggest breakout player on that team has been the incredible play skill of Andrew Jessup. And this is a Modern top 8 this weekend. Jessup has the best results in Modern of anyone on that team, and I think he could take it down.
Patrick, deck for each format, player, before we wrap.
I would probably play, in Standard, I think I would play Temur Emerge, probably much closer to Odin Turnwald's a little bit more graveyard-centric build than Andrew Brown's, Emerge-specific build of the deck.
Okay.
For Modern, I would be looking for decks that win on turn 3.5 and largely ignore combat. So you could talk me into burn pretty easily. I think some of the Through the Breach strategies, I would also be interested. As far as a player goes, I'm going to go with Todd Anderson, just a player who's been dominant throughout Season 2, has had an incredible run on the SCG Tour now for several years, very proficient in both formats, and I'm interested to see what the Teamer box looks like this weekend. It may not be the best choice for Tarmogoyf and Lightning Bolt and friends, backed up by Cryptic Command, but if anyone can pull it off, it's Todd.
I'll make it quick. Standard, I want to play that company. Because it's still good. That pains me. I would have no fun doing it. Modern, I would play Dredge, because I'm just going to, I think that deck's absurd, so I'm just going to play it. And in regards to who I'm picking this weekend, I'm actually going to pick someone who, this is like cheating in picking the world champion, but I'm going to do it because Seth Manfield's here, and he never loses ever. So I'm going to pick Seth. He's here this week, and I don't actually know what he's playing in the other format, but you can expect to see pinpoint, precise, fantastic play from him, so hopefully you'll have some time to watch him. But we're done. Players are behind us. They're sitting down for the player meeting here for our Invitational New Jersey. So we take a short break. We're getting everything set up. When you come back, Patrick and I will lead things off, and we're going to start watching 8 rounds of Magic today, 8 rounds of Magic tomorrow, cut to elimination rounds on Sunday. Someone's walking out of here with a whole bunch of money, $10,000, and an invite to our Players Championship and the Pro Tour. So we start all of that here from New Jersey in just a bit.